Dr. Elijah Ward, a prominent black surgeon, arrives in a small town to improve its failing healthcare system, but his efforts are met with blatant racism and systemic corruption. Targeted by a racist police officer and a corrupt hospital administrator, Elijah faces unjust detention and attempts to discredit his work. As he uncovers financial exploitation and prejudice within the hospital and law enforcement, the story exposes the infuriating realities of racism in America and the abuse of power in marginalized communities. Elijah's fight against these forces becomes a powerful stand for justice and accountability. Dr. Elijah Ward adjusted the strap of his weathered leather satchel as he stepped out of his sleek silver sedan. The faint aroma of fresh rain lingered in the small downtown district of Elmsford, a town that seemed to have stopped evolving sometime in the 1970s. Its cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts hinted at struggles to keep pace with modernity, but Elijah had always found charm in its simplicity. Despite his success as the founder and CEO of one of the nation's top biotech firms, he had never abandoned his humble routines. Today was no exception. He locked the car and strolled toward a modest diner on the corner of Main Street, his gait confident but unassuming. Dressed in a navy cardigan over a crisp white shirt and jeans, Elijah looked more like a college professor than a multimillionaire. This was intentional. Elijah had long believed that authenticity, not ostentation, was the hallmark of true power. Inside the diner, the smell of frying bacon and brewing coffee filled the air. A row of swivel stools lined the counter, their vinyl cracked from years of service. The booths, upholstered in red leather, were occupied by a mix of regulars, a retired couple sharing the morning paper, a young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained with a sugar packet. Elijah approached the counter, nodding a polite greeting to a waitress who was clearing plates. Her name tag read Karen. She gave him a quick once-over, her eyes lingering a second too long on his sneakers, and offered a tight-lipped smile. "Coffee to go," Elijah said, his voice warm and measured. Karen scribbled on her pad without looking up. "Be right with you." Elijah wasn't in a hurry, so he leaned against the counter and glanced around the room. He noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere as a few heads turned in his direction. The diner's chatter dulled slightly, replaced by the faint weight of scrutiny. It wasn't outright hostility, more like curiosity tinged with something unspoken. The town of Elmsford was predominantly white, and its residents weren't used to seeing someone like Elijah. A black man of his stature and demeanor, walking into their spaces, often invited questions he'd grown accustomed to leaving unanswered. What brought him here? Who did he think he was? And most importantly, did he belong? Elijah's thoughts were interrupted when the door jingled behind him. A man in his mid-50s entered, his tan uniform crisp, a badge glinting under the fluorescent light. Officer Donald Briggs, Elmsford's longest-serving cop, took stock of the diner with a hawk-like gaze before his eyes landed on Elijah. Briggs had a way of making his presence felt. He wasn't aggressive, but there was a deliberate weight to his steps as he walked toward the counter, his boots scuffing against the tiles. He took the stool nearest Elijah and ordered a coffee. "You passing through?" Briggs asked casually, though his tone carried a note of practiced indifference. Elijah turned toward him, offering a polite smile. "No, just here for the day. I have a meeting with the mayor this afternoon." Briggs raised an eyebrow. "That's so. What kind of business brings you to Elmsford?" Before Elijah could respond, Karen returned with his coffee. She placed the cup on the counter and muttered, "$2.50. Elijah handed her a $5 bill. "Keep the change." Karen hesitated for a moment, as though debating whether to accept the tip. Finally, she nodded and walked away, her expression unreadable. Elijah took a sip of his coffee before answering Briggs. "I'm working on a project to expand medical access in underserved areas. Elmsford's hospital is underfunded and understaffed. Mayor Tillman reached out for help." The words were simple, straightforward, but Elijah knew what they carried. He wasn't just a visitor. He was a black man offering solutions in a space that didn't always see itself as having problems. Briggs tilted his head slightly, his expression carefully neutral. "Big job must mean you're some kind of doctor." "I am," Elijah replied, setting his coffee on the counter. "Neurosurgeon by training, but I spend most of my time running the company I founded." Briggs let out a low whistle. "Impressive." It was the kind of compliment that wasn't a compliment at all. An observation, tinged with disbelief. Elijah had encountered it countless times before. He didn't take offense, but neither did he dismiss the subtle edge in the officer's voice. The tension in the room began to build as Briggs continued to press. "Guess you don't come out to places like Elmsford much then?" "I try to stay grounded," Elijah replied evenly. "Places like this remind me of where I come from." Briggs chuckled softly, though his eyes remained sharp. "And where would that be?" "South Side Chicago," Elijah said without hesitation. He'd long since stopped hiding the parts of his story that made people uncomfortable. "Grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment with my mother and 3 siblings, worked my way through med school with scholarships and side jobs." Briggs leaned back slightly, his expression shifting ever so slightly. "Well, good for you. Not everyone's got the drive to pull that off." Karen reappeared with a rag to wipe down the counter, her presence providing a temporary reprieve. Elijah took another sip of his coffee and checked his watch. He still had a few minutes before he needed to leave for his meeting. "Seems like you've done all right for yourself," Briggs said finally. "But if you don't mind me saying, fancy titles and big ideas don't always sit well with folks around here." Elijah met the officer's gaze, his expression calm. "I'm not here to impress anyone, Officer Briggs. I'm here to help." The door jingled again, and this time, 2 younger officers walked in, their laughter cutting through the subdued atmosphere. They stopped short when they saw Briggs at the counter, their eyes flickering toward Elijah briefly, before one of them muttered something under his breath. Briggs waved them over, and they exchanged pleasantries before one of the younger officers nodded toward Elijah. "You with the good doctor, Don?" Briggs smirked faintly. "Just making conversation." Elijah finished his coffee and placed the empty cup neatly on the counter. He reached for his satchel, slinging it over his shoulder. "It's been a pleasure," he said, offering a nod to Briggs and Karen. As he walked toward the door, he heard one of the younger officers mutter behind him. "Bet he drives something flashy Tesla Mercedes?" Briggs's voice carried after them. "Silver sedan clean, but not too flashy." Elijah paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He turned slightly, just enough for his voice to carry across the diner. "Lexus, actually. But I don't drive it to make statements, I drive it because it's safe." With that, he stepped outside, the door swinging shut behind him. The faint echo of muted laughter followed him into the street, but Elijah didn't flinch. He'd been here before, countless times. The dismissive remarks, the attempts to put him in his place, they were as predictable as the rising sun. As Elijah walked toward his car, the feeling of eyes on him lingered. He knew his presence in Elmsford wasn't just about a meeting with the mayor or a coffee stop at a local diner. It was about being seen, about standing in spaces where he wasn't expected, and about challenging the quiet prejudices that followed him like shadows. He opened the door to his car, slid inside, and took a deep breath. The day was just beginning, and the storm was already gathering. Elijah parked his car in front of the Elmsford Town Hall, its stone facade weathered but stately. The building had clearly been maintained with care, its polished brass fixtures gleaming in the midday sun. He grabbed his satchel and stepped onto the sidewalk, his shoulders straightening as he approached the entrance. Inside, the receptionist glanced up, her expression neutral, until she took in Elijah's presence. Her polite smile faltered slightly, a hesitation so fleeting that most wouldn't have noticed it. But Elijah did. He always noticed. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice professional but clipped. "Elijah Ward," he said, offering a slight smile. "I have a meeting with Mayor Tillman at noon." She gave him a once-over, her eyes lingering briefly on his casual attire. "I'll let the mayor know you're here. Have a seat." She gestured toward a row of uncomfortable-looking chairs along the wall. Elijah nodded and took a seat. As he settled in, he could feel the receptionist's gaze flicker toward him intermittently. It wasn't hostility, more like suspicion, as though she were trying to reconcile his presence in her carefully ordered space. He pulled out his tablet, reviewing notes for his presentation, while ignoring the low hum of whispers from the reception desk. After a few minutes, the door to the mayor's office opened, and a tall, silver-haired man in a tailored suit stepped out. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "Dr. Ward," Mayor Tillman said warmly, "thank you for coming. Please, come in." Elijah followed him into the office, noting the polished wood furniture and the neatly framed certificates on the walls. Tillman gestured for Elijah to take a seat across from his large desk, then sat down, folding his hands on the surface. "I appreciate you making the trip," Tillman began. "Elmsford's hospital has been struggling for years, and I'm hoping your expertise can guide us toward a solution." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his tone professional but earnest. "It's clear that the hospital needs immediate support, more staffing, updated equipment, and additional funding to cover critical gaps in care. I've already drafted a proposal for how we can secure private investments while advocating for state-level grants." As Elijah spoke, Tillman's polite smile began to waver. He shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "That all sounds ambitious," Tillman said finally, his tone measured. "But I wonder if we're perhaps overestimating the urgency here. Elmsford's been managing just fine for decades." Elijah's brow furrowed. "Managing, yes, but the health outcomes in this community tell a different story. Increased mortality rates, preventable hospitalizations, these are clear indicators of systemic issues." Tillman's smile tightened. "Dr. Ward, I appreciate your perspective, but I also know my community. What we need is practical, incremental change. These large-scale reforms you're suggesting may not align with what Elmsford is ready for." The words hung in the air, and Elijah felt a familiar frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. It wasn't the first time his ideas had been dismissed as overambitious, nor the first time he'd been met with thinly veiled condescension. "I understand the importance of balancing ambition with practicality," Elijah said evenly. "But delaying action will only deepen the challenges Elmsford is facing. With the right approach we can—" Tillman held up a hand, cutting him off. "I hear you, Dr. Ward. But as mayor, I have to consider the broader picture." Elijah forced himself to smile, though his jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Of course I'm here to support however I can." The conversation shifted to logistical details, but the underlying tension remained. By the time Elijah left the office, his satchel felt heavier than when he'd arrived. As Elijah stepped out into the bright afternoon, he paused for a moment to center himself. He inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air calm his racing thoughts. He had expected resistance, but the mayor's reluctance still stung. He was halfway to his car when he noticed Officer Briggs leaning against a patrol car parked across the street. Their eyes met, and Briggs offered a slow, knowing smirk before crossing the street to approach him. "Well, look who's still in town," Briggs said, his tone casual but his gaze sharp. "How'd the meeting go?" Elijah straightened his posture, refusing to let the man's presence unsettle him. "It went fine." Briggs nodded, his hands resting on his utility belt. "Good to hear. You know, I couldn't help but notice your car when I was patrolling earlier. Nice ride, bet it stands out around here." Elijah kept his expression neutral. "I suppose it does." Briggs tilted his head slightly, his tone taking on an edge. "You've got a lot of folks curious about you, Dr. Ward, big city guy coming into a small town, talking about change. Not everyone's a fan of that." "I'm here to help," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "That's all." Briggs chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Just a friendly piece of advice. Sometimes it's better to blend in, makes things easier for everyone." Elijah's patience thinned, but he refused to let it show. "I'll keep that in mind." Briggs lingered for a moment longer, his smirk fading into a more serious expression. "You take care now," he said before turning and walking back to his car. Elijah watched him go, a knot tightening in his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd received a warning disguised as friendly advice, and he doubted it would be the last. Elijah's next stop was the Elmsford General Hospital. He had arranged a tour to better understand the facility's needs and to meet with the staff. As he entered the aging building, the dim fluorescent lights and scuffed linoleum floors confirmed what he already suspected. The hospital was in desperate need of resources. A young nurse greeted him at the reception desk, her face lighting up when he introduced himself. "Dr. Ward, I've read about your work. It's an honor to meet you." "Thank you," Elijah said with a warm smile. "I'm looking forward to learning more about what you're doing here." The nurse escorted him through the hospital, introducing him to staff members and pointing out areas in need of improvement. Most of the employees were welcoming, their gratitude palpable. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. In the staff lounge, Elijah was introduced to the hospital's chief administrator, Richard Hayes. A tall man with a ruddy complexion and a firm handshake, Hayes exuded an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. "Dr. Ward," Hayes said, his tone polite but cool. "I've heard a lot about you." "I hope it's all good," Elijah replied, extending his hand. Hayes shook it briefly, his grip firm. "Your reputation precedes you. But I'll admit, I'm a bit skeptical about this initiative. Elmsford General has been operating under tight budgets for years, and we've managed just fine. Change sounds nice, but it's not always practical." Elijah met Hayes's gaze evenly. "I understand your concerns, but my goal is to make sustainable improvements that benefit everyone, staff and patients alike." Hayes's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see how that plays out." The rest of the tour continued without incident, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling of resistance lurking beneath the surface. By the time he left the hospital, the weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. As Elijah drove out of town, the words of Mayor Tillman, Officer Briggs, and Richard Hayes swirled in his mind. Each encounter had been laced with subtle dismissals and coded language, reminders that his presence, and his purpose, was unwelcome in certain circles. But Elijah had long since learned how to channel his frustration into resolve. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he wasn't alone. For every Briggs or Hayes, there were nurses and staff members who believed in his mission. They were the reason he kept pushing forward. Elijah gripped the steering wheel tighter as he turned onto the highway. The storm was brewing, but he was ready to face it head-on. Elijah's return to Elmsford the following week was meant to be low-key. The mayor had grudgingly agreed to a follow-up meeting to discuss the logistics of Elijah's proposed changes for the hospital, but the tension from their initial conversation still lingered in the air. Elijah arrived early, his mind focused on refining his arguments. He knew his ideas were sound, but the resistance he'd encountered made him acutely aware that sound reasoning wasn't always enough. As he walked into the town hall, he noticed Officer Briggs standing near the entrance, chatting casually with another officer. When Briggs saw Elijah, his smile faded into something unreadable. Elijah gave him a polite nod, but Briggs didn't respond. Instead, his gaze lingered on Elijah's satchel, then on the ID badge clipped to his jacket. "Morning, Dr. Ward," Briggs said finally, his voice carrying just enough edge to suggest this wasn't a friendly greeting. "Back so soon?" "Just here for the mayor," Elijah replied, his tone measured. He moved toward the door, but Briggs stepped into his path. "Mind if I have a quick word?" Elijah paused, his patience tested but intact. "Of course." Briggs took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I've been hearing a lot about you big plans, big changes, but not everyone appreciates outsiders coming in and stirring the pot." Elijah met Briggs's gaze, unflinching. "I'm here to help, officer. That's all." Briggs tilted his head, his smirk returning. "Help's a funny thing. Sometimes people don't see it that way. You take care now." Without waiting for a response, Briggs stepped aside, letting Elijah pass. Elijah walked through the doors, his shoulders straight, despite the tight knot forming in his chest. He had dealt with men like Briggs before, men who wielded authority like a weapon, using intimidation to maintain a fragile sense of control. But this encounter felt different. It felt personal. The mayor's office was crowded when Elijah entered. Along with Tillman and Richard Hayes, several town council members were present, their expressions ranging from mildly interested to openly skeptical. Elijah placed his satchel on the table and began his presentation, outlining the key points of his proposal with calm precision. As he spoke, he noticed Hayes whispering to the councilwoman next to him, their expressions shifting to barely concealed disdain. Elijah pressed on, refusing to let their dismissiveness derail him, but when he finished, the room remained silent for a long moment, before Tillman finally spoke. "Dr. Ward," Tillman said, leaning back in his chair, "we appreciate your passion, but I'm not sure your proposal aligns with Elmsford's values. You're asking for significant changes to a system that, while not perfect, has served us well enough." "Served who well enough?" Elijah countered, his voice firm but controlled. "The data shows clear disparities in health outcomes, particularly for the town's minority populations. These aren't abstract numbers, they're lives." Hayes snorted, shaking his head. With all due respect, Dr. Ward, you've been here what, 2 days? Forgive me if I don't take kindly to being lectured about my own town. Elijah took a steadying breath. This isn't about me, it's about ensuring everyone in this community has access to quality care. Ignoring the problem won't make it go away. The tension in the room was palpable, but before anyone could respond, the door burst open. Officer Briggs stood in the doorway, his face a mask of feigned urgency. Sorry to interrupt, Briggs said, his gaze locking onto Elijah. Dr. Ward, I need you to come with me. Elijah frowned, his mind racing. What's this about? Briggs stepped into the room, his tone casual, but firm. We've had a report of suspicious activity involving your vehicle. I'll need you to answer a few questions down at the station. Elijah's stomach dropped, but he forced himself to remain calm. Suspicious activity. My car's been parked outside since I arrived. Briggs shrugged, his smirk returning. Just doing my job. Tillman cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. Officer Briggs, I'm sure this can wait until after our meeting. Briggs's smile didn't waver. Sorry, Mayor, but I have to follow procedure. Elijah stood, his expression unreadable. Let's get this over with. The walk to the patrol car felt like a gauntlet. Town hall staff and passers-by stopped to stare, their murmurs blending into a low hum of speculation. Briggs didn't bother with subtlety. He placed a firm hand on Elijah's arm, steering him toward the car as though he were a flight risk. Elijah's composure remained intact, but inside, anger churned like a storm. When they arrived at the station, Briggs led Elijah through the front entrance, ensuring every officer in the room could see them. The din of conversation quieted as heads turned, curiosity and judgment written on every face. Briggs guided Elijah into an interrogation room and gestured for him to sit. Wait here, he said before leaving and shutting the door. Elijah sat, his hands resting calmly on the table, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He replayed the events in his mind, searching for the rationale behind Briggs's actions. There was no doubt this was deliberate, a calculated attempt to undermine him. But why now? Why this? The door opened again, and Briggs entered with another officer, a younger man who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. Briggs dropped a folder on the table and opened it, pulling out a piece of paper. We ran the plates on your car, Briggs began, his tone almost smug. Turns out, it matches the description of a vehicle reported stolen last month. Elijah stared at him, incredulous. That's impossible, I've owned that car for years. Briggs leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with manufactured authority. Got proof of that? Elijah's calm cracked, just slightly. The registration's in the glove compartment. You're welcome to check. Briggs smirked. We'll see about that. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Sir, maybe we should... Briggs silenced him with a sharp glance. I've got this. Elijah met Briggs's gaze, his voice steady, despite the rising tension. This is a waste of time, and you know it. Briggs straightened, his smirk fading. Watch your tone, Dr. Ward, I'm just doing my job. Hours passed. Elijah remained in the interrogation room. The door closed, but not soundproof. He could hear the murmurs of officers outside, their voices carrying just enough to remind him that he was being watched, judged. Finally, the door opened again. This time, it was the younger officer, his expression apologetic. You're free to go, he said quietly. We confirmed your registration. Elijah stood, his patience worn thin. And Officer Briggs? The young man hesitated, then shook his head. I'm sorry, well, he's not exactly the apologizing type. Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. Of course he isn't. As he stepped out of the station, the cool evening air hit him like a wave, washing away the oppressive atmosphere of the room, but the weight of what had happened lingered. This wasn't just about one officer's actions, it was about the system that enabled him, the culture that allowed bias to masquerade as duty. Elijah's mind raced as he drove back to his hotel, the humiliation, the frustration, the injustice. It all boiled down to one question. What now? He could report Briggs, but he knew how those complaints often ended. He could escalate the issue publicly, but that would risk overshadowing his work in Elmsford. As he parked and stepped into the quiet lobby, his phone buzzed. It was a text from a nurse at Elmsford. General saw what happened. We've got your back. Elijah stared at the message, his resolve hardening. Briggs's actions weren't just an attack on him. They were a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. But Elijah wasn't here to back down. As he sat in his room, staring out at the darkened town, a plan began to take shape. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to shine a light on the cracks in the system, no matter how deep they ran. The battle was just beginning. The morning after Elijah's release, the events of the previous day had already begun circulating. The local news had picked up the story, thanks in part to witnesses who filmed Officer Briggs escorting Elijah from the town hall. The footage showed no resistance from Elijah, only his quiet dignity contrasted with Briggs's domineering demeanor. The headline on one local outlet read, "Notable surgeon detained in Elmsford, community questions police motives." Elijah stared at his phone, reading the article again, his jaw tightening. The fallout was starting, but it wasn't enough. He couldn't let the narrative fade into another brief controversy that was swept under the rug. He needed to take control, and fast. A knock at his hotel room door pulled him from his thoughts. Elijah opened it to find Mitchell Hayes, the son of Richard Hayes, the hospital administrator. Unlike his father, Mitchell was an idealistic young doctor who had joined Elmsford General recently. He'd been one of the few staff members who openly supported Elijah's proposals. "Dr. Ward," Mitchell began, stepping inside, "I saw the news. I can't believe they did that to you." Elijah gestured for Mitchell to sit, closing the door behind him. "Unfortunately, I can. This isn't the first time I've dealt with something like this." Mitchell's face darkened. "It's not right. Everyone at the hospital knows Briggs is a bully, but no one stands up to him. He's too well connected." Elijah crossed his arms, leaning against the desk. "That's exactly the problem, Mitchell. This isn't just about Briggs, it's about the culture that lets him operate unchecked, and now it's become a distraction from the work we need to do." Mitchell hesitated before speaking. "What are you going to do?" Elijah's expression hardened. I've tried to approach this diplomatically, but that's clearly not enough. They want to intimidate me, silence me. I won't let that happen." Later that afternoon, Elijah stood outside the community center where he'd arranged an impromptu town hall meeting. Word had spread quickly, and by the time he stepped inside, the room was nearly full. Residents of all backgrounds filled the seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Some were allies he'd already made during his visits to Elmsford. Others were skeptics, waiting to see what he had to say. Elijah approached the podium, his presence commanding, but calm. The murmurs quieted as he began to speak. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he started, his voice steady. "I'm here today not just as a doctor, but as someone who believes in the potential of this town. Over the past few weeks, I've met incredible people, nurses, doctors, and residents who are working tirelessly to make Elmsford better, but I've also seen the barriers holding this community back." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Yesterday, I was detained by Officer Briggs on false pretenses. While that experience was humiliating, it wasn't unique. It's part of a pattern. One that affects not just me, but countless others who are judged not for what they've done, but for who they are." The room buzzed with whispers, but Elijah pressed on. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that needs accountability. I'm here to fight for change, not just in the hospital, but across this community, and I need your support to do it." As Elijah finished, a figure stood at the back of the room. Richard Hayes, the hospital administrator, cleared his throat loudly, silencing the crowd. "Dr. Ward," Hayes began, his tone polite but cutting. "I appreciate your passion, but you're an outsider. You don't know Elmsford like we do. Your ideas may sound good on paper, but they're not realistic for a town like ours." Elijah met Hayes's gaze, his voice unwavering. "Realistic doesn't mean acceptable, Mr. Hayes. The status quo is failing this town. Pretending otherwise won't solve anything." The tension between the two men was palpable. Hayes smirked, shaking his head. "And you think making inflammatory accusations against our police force will help Officer Briggs has served this community for decades. If there was a misunderstanding, I'm sure it can be resolved without turning it into a spectacle." Elijah stepped forward, his calm facade cracking just slightly. "This isn't a misunderstanding, and it's not just about me. It's about ensuring no one else in this community has to endure what I did yesterday." A voice from the audience interrupted. "He's right." It was Mrs. Walker, an elderly black woman who had lived in Elmsford her entire life. "People like Briggs have been getting away with this for years. It's about time someone called them out." Her statement sparked murmurs of agreement, but it also drew glares from others. The room divided sharply, some applauding Elijah's words, while others grumbled about outsiders causing trouble. After the meeting, Elijah stepped outside into the cool evening air, his mind racing. The crowd had dispersed, but the impact of his speech lingered. He had drawn a line in the sand, and he knew there would be consequences. As he approached his car, he saw Briggs leaning against the hood, his arms crossed. His smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, measured stare. "Bold speech, Doc," Briggs said, his voice low, "but you're playing a dangerous game." Elijah stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding, but his expression calm. "I'm not playing any games, Officer Briggs. I'm standing up for what's right." Briggs pushed off the car, stepping closer. "You think you can waltz into my town and tell me how to do my job? You don't know what you're messing with." Elijah held his ground. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, a culture of intimidation and corruption, and I'm not afraid of you." For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension crackled like a live wire, their standoff drawing the attention of passers-by. Finally, Briggs smirked again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll regret this," he said before walking away. Elijah watched him go, his resolve hardening. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no turning back. That night, Elijah sat at his desk, reviewing his notes. His phone buzzed with messages from supporters and allies, but one caught his attention. A message from Mitchell Hayes. "You need to see this. Meet me at the hospital, after hours." Elijah's stomach tightened. He knew whatever Mitchell wanted to share would be important. He grabbed his satchel and headed out, the weight of the day pressing on him, but failing to crush his determination. As he arrived at the hospital, the parking lot was nearly empty, the building illuminated only by a few scattered lights. Mitchell was waiting at the side entrance, his expression tense. "What's this about?" Elijah asked as he approached. Mitchell glanced around nervously before replying, "It's worse than we thought. I found something in the hospital records, something you need to see." Without another word, he led Elijah inside. They moved through the quiet halls, their footsteps echoing faintly. Mitchell stopped at an office and unlocked the door, gesturing for Elijah to enter. Inside, Mitchell pulled up a series of documents on the computer. "Look at this," he said, scrolling through patient files. "Billing records, supply orders, staffing budgets, they don't add up." Elijah frowned, leaning closer. "What are you saying?" Mitchell hesitated, then met Elijah's gaze. "There's a paper trail. Someone's been skimming funds meant for patient care supplies that should have been delivered never arrived, and I think my father knows about it." Elijah's heart sank. This wasn't just about the hospital's inefficiency, it was corruption. And now he was at the center of it. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Mitchell's eyes widened. "We need to go," he whispered. But it was too late. The door swung open, and two figures stepped inside, Officer Briggs and Richard Hayes. "Well, well," Hayes said, his tone dripping with contempt. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little conspiracy." Elijah stood tall, his mind racing. The trap had been set, but he wasn't about to back down. Elijah's heart pounded as Briggs and Hayes stepped into the office, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. Mitchell, still seated at the computer, froze, his face pale. Elijah, however, remained standing, his shoulders squared, his expression calm but firm. He had seen moments like this before, moments where power was used not to protect but to intimidate, and he refused to let it rattle him. "Well, this is quite the scene," Hayes said, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Dr. Ward, I had a feeling you'd overstep, but I didn't think you'd drag my son into your crusade." Mitchell stood abruptly, his voice trembling. "Dad, this isn't about sides. I found these records and they're—" "Enough," Hayes snapped, his voice cutting through the room. "You don't know what you're talking about." Briggs leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his eyes locked on Elijah. Funny how trouble seems to follow you, Dr. First, yesterday, and now this starting to look like a pattern. Elijah ignored Briggs's taunt, his focus on Hayes. Your son found evidence of fraud funds meant for hospital improvements, staff salaries, medical supplies. They've been siphoned off, and the community is suffering because of it. You've been stealing from the people you claim to serve. Hayes's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before his polished veneer returned. Bold accusation, got any proof to back it up? Elijah gestured toward the computer. It's all right there. Records don't lie. Briggs pushed off the doorframe, taking a step closer. You've got a lot of nerve, Ward coming into my town, accusing good people of corruption. Elijah turned to face Briggs, his voice steady but edged with steel. Your town. Is that what this is about, protecting the status quo at all costs, even if it means looking the other way when people like Hayes exploit the system? Briggs's smirk disappeared, his jaw tightening. I'll watch your mouth. Mitchell, emboldened by Elijah's resolve, moved back to the computer and pulled up another file. It's not just mismanagement, Dad. These invoices show inflated prices for supplies that never arrived. And here, he pointed at the screen, his voice gaining strength. The hospital's operating budget doesn't match the actual expenditures, someone's pocketing the difference. Hayes's face darkened. Mitchell, you have no idea what you're talking about. These things are complicated. There are accounting errors, discrepancies. It doesn't mean anything. Elijah stepped closer, his voice low but firm. The only thing it means is that you've been caught. You've been bleeding this community dry while pretending to care about its well-being. Hayes sneered, his polished facade cracking. And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it? Run to the press, file a complaint? No one's going to listen to some outsider stirring up trouble. Briggs nodded, stepping beside Hayes. He's right, you're in over your head. You think you can take us on. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Elijah's gaze swept between them, his mind racing. He had expected resistance, but the depth of their collusion was staggering, yet he refused to back down. You're right, Elijah said finally, his tone deliberate. I don't know every connection you have, every person you've managed to manipulate, but I do know this. I'm not alone. Hayes and Briggs exchanged a glance, their confidence faltering slightly. This isn't just about me, Elijah continued. It's about the people in this community who are tired of being ignored, who want better for themselves and their families, and it's about people like Mitchell, people who are willing to stand up and tell the truth. Mitchell looked at Elijah, his expression a mix of fear and determination. He's right. I'm not going to stay silent. Hayes's face twisted with anger. You ungrateful little... Careful, Elijah interjected, his voice sharp. Threatening your own son won't make this go away. Briggs stepped forward, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. You're making a big mistake, Ward. Elijah's eyes flicked to the weapon, then back to Briggs's face. And what are you going to do? Officer, arrest me again, fabricate more charges. Go ahead. Every move you make just proves my point. Briggs's hand twitched, but he didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he glared at Elijah, his composure cracking under the pressure. At that moment, the sound of voices echoed down the hall. Elijah turned toward the doorway to see several hospital staff members entering, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Among them was Mrs. Walker, the elderly woman who had spoken up at the community meeting. What's going on here? She demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. Hayes's expression soured further. This is a private matter. Not anymore, Mrs. Walker shot back. We've had enough of your private matters, Mr. Hayes. If Dr. Ward has something to say, we're going to hear it. The staff began murmuring in agreement, their collective presence emboldening Elijah. Elijah, Mitchell whispered urgently, show them the records. Elijah moved to the computer, projecting the files onto a nearby screen. As the incriminating evidence filled the display, gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. This is what they've been hiding, Elijah said, his voice rising with conviction. This is why the hospital is understaffed, why critical supplies are missing. This is why the community is suffering. Hayes stepped forward, his face red with anger. You don't understand the pressure we're under. Do you think it's easy running a hospital in a town like this? I did what I had to do to keep things afloat. You did what you had to do to keep your pockets full, Mrs. Walker said, her voice icy. And you did it at our expense. Briggs, sensing the tide turning, moved toward the crowd, his hand still near his weapon. All right, everyone, that's enough. Disperse before this gets out of hand. But the staff didn't move. They stood their ground, their collective defiance a stark contrast to Briggs's attempts at control. You can't silence us, Elijah said, stepping in front of the group. Not this time. The weight of Elijah's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Briggs and Hayes looked genuinely uncertain. Their authority, once unquestioned, now felt fragile in the face of the community's united front. The sound of approaching sirens broke the tense silence. The group turned toward the windows as police cars pulled into the hospital parking lot, their lights flashing. Briggs smirked, his confidence returning. Looks like backup's here. But Elijah didn't flinch. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady. This isn't over. Stay strong, stay together. As the police entered the building, the tension reached its breaking point. Elijah stood tall, his resolve unshaken, ready to face whatever came next. The tension in the hospital office was suffocating. Officer Briggs stood just inside the doorway, one hand resting on his utility belt, his presence an unmistakable reminder of authority. Beside him, Richard Hayes glared at Elijah, his face twisted in frustration. Mitchell hovered near the computer, his hands trembling slightly as he scrolled through the incriminating files, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. You've crossed a line, Ward, Hayes spat, his voice a venomous hiss. You have no idea what kind of fire you're playing with. Elijah stood tall, his expression calm but resolute. He could feel the heat of Hayes's anger, the pressure of Briggs's gaze, but he refused to back down. I'm not playing, Mr. Hayes. I'm here to expose the truth. If you were doing your job, serving this community honestly, we wouldn't be here. Briggs stepped forward, his boots heavy against the tile floor. You don't belong here, Doctor. You're just an outsider trying to make a name for yourself. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. What I'm doing has nothing to do with my name, and everything to do with the people this hospital is supposed to serve, the people you've ignored, stolen from, and dismissed. Briggs smirked, but there was no humor in it. Bold words for someone who doesn't know how things work in this town. Mitchell hesitated, then turned the monitor toward the group, his voice cracking but determined. He's telling the truth, Dad. These files, these transactions, prove everything supplies ordered, but never delivered, funds allocated for equipment, but redirected to shell accounts. It's all here. Hayes's face darkened, and for a moment, a flicker of panic crossed his features, but it was quickly replaced with anger. You think you found some grand conspiracy? He sneered. This is how the real world works. You do what you have to do to keep things moving. Without me, this hospital would have closed years ago. You didn't save the hospital, Elijah shot back. You exploited it, and every dollar you took came at the expense of patients who trusted you. The words hit Hayes like a blow, and his composure cracked. Don't you dare lecture me, he snapped. You think you're better than me? You come into this town with your holier-than-thou attitude, trying to fix things you don't understand. Briggs's voice cut through the rising tension. Enough. This ends now. He moved toward Elijah, his hand brushing against his holster. You're under arrest. Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped back, his voice calm but firm. On what charge, Officer Briggs? Exposing the truth. Or is this just another attempt to silence me? Briggs's smirk faltered for the first time. Obstruction of justice, trespassing. Take your pick. You're reaching, Elijah said, his tone measured, and everyone in this room knows it. Behind him, the growing murmur of voices became louder. Hospital staff and a few community members had gathered in the hallway, drawn by the commotion. Their eyes bore witness to the unfolding confrontation, their whispers carrying both curiosity and outrage. What's going on? Someone asked from the crowd. Elijah's right, Mitchell said, his voice breaking the rising din. The files don't lie. My dad and Officer Briggs have been working together to cover this up. Gasps rippled through the group, and Hayes turned on his son, his voice low and furious. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough, Mitchell replied, his face pale but resolute. And so do they. Elijah turned to the crowd, his voice carrying over the noise. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. It's about holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they think they are. Briggs's composure cracked as he stepped closer to Elijah, his hand now firmly on his holster. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he growled. "Let's see how high and mighty you are in a cell." Elijah's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for everyone in this room, for every person who had been silenced or ignored. "Go ahead," Elijah said, his voice sharp. "Arrest me, drag me out of here in front of all these witnesses, but you'd better be ready for what comes next." Briggs froze, his hand hovering over his weapon. The crowd was silent now, their eyes locked on him. For the first time, the weight of their collective gaze seemed to sink in. Hayes, sensing his ally wavering, stepped forward. "Don't be stupid, Briggs, do your job." But Briggs hesitated. The tide was shifting, and he could feel it. It was Mrs. Walker who broke the silence. Stepping out of the crowd, her voice was steady and unwavering. "We see you, Officer Briggs. We see all of you." Her words were a rallying cry. More voices joined hers, rising in defiance. "This has gone on long enough," someone shouted. "We won't stand for this anymore." The crowd surged forward, their collective outrage a tangible force. Briggs took a step back, his confidence crumbling. Hayes looked around, his face pale, his once unshakable authority now fragile. "This isn't over," Hayes hissed, glaring at Elijah. "You think you've won, but you haven't." Elijah met his gaze, his voice calm but unyielding. "It's over when the people say it's over, and they're saying it now." The distant sound of sirens cut through the noise, drawing everyone's attention. The crowd parted as another group of officers entered the building, their expressions unreadable. Briggs straightened, his confidence returning. "Back up," he muttered under his breath. "Let's see how you talk your way out of this one." But as the officers approached, their leader, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, stopped in front of Elijah. "Dr. Ward?" she asked. "Yes," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "We've received multiple reports about misconduct in this hospital," she said, her tone neutral. "We'd like to review the evidence." Elijah nodded, stepping aside to let Mitchell show the files. The crowd watched in tense silence as the officers began their investigation. Briggs and Hayes stood frozen, their authority slipping away with each passing second. Elijah, however, felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was turning. As the officers began examining the files, the room buzzed with anticipation. The next move was critical, and Elijah knew the stakes had never been higher. The hum of tension in the room lingered as the senior officer, Captain Daniels, scanned the documents Mitchell had retrieved. The silence was broken only by the occasional murmurs of the crowd that had gathered, their emotions ranging from anger to anticipation. Richard Hayes and Officer Briggs stood off to the side, their confidence now visibly shaken, their earlier bluster replaced by an uneasy silence. Daniels finally looked up, her sharp gaze landing on Briggs and Hayes. "This evidence is damning," she said, her voice clipped and authoritative. "Funds were redirected to unauthorized accounts, supplies intended for the hospital never arrived. This is theft, plain and simple." Mitchell stepped forward, his voice steadier than before. "I've cross-checked everything, it's all there. The community has been suffering because of this." Daniels nodded, her expression hardening. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes. Your courage in bringing this forward is commendable." Briggs took a step forward, his voice rising in desperation. "This is a misunderstanding, Dr. Ward, and this kid are blowing things out of proportion. None of this proves any wrongdoing." Daniels turned to him, her jaw tightening. "Officer Briggs, your name is mentioned in several of these files as having signed off on transactions that didn't align with hospital operations. That, combined with yesterday's incident involving Dr. Ward, raises serious concerns about your conduct." The room buzzed with whispers as Daniels continued. "I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave pending an internal investigation." Briggs's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to protest, but Daniels silenced him with a sharp glare. "Do not make this worse for yourself." Richard Hayes, however, wasn't ready to back down. "You can't do this," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "I've dedicated my life to this hospital. This town needs me." Elijah stepped forward, his calm resolve cutting through the chaos. This town doesn't need someone who profits off its suffering. The people here deserve leaders who put their well-being above their own interests. The gathered crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder in support. Hayes's shoulders sagged as the weight of public opinion bore down on him. Captain Daniels addressed Hayes directly. "Mr. Hayes, based on the evidence presented, you're being placed under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As the words sank in, Hayes's bravado crumbled entirely. The senior officer cuffed him and led him toward the door, the crowd parting to let them pass. Some cheered, others simply watched in silence, but the collective relief in the room was palpable. As the commotion died down, Elijah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The battle had been grueling, and while this was a significant victory, he knew it was only the beginning. Mitchell approached him, his expression a mix of gratitude and regret. "I'm sorry for what my father put you through," Mitchell said quietly. "And thank you for standing up when so many others wouldn't." Elijah placed a hand on Mitchell's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Mitchell. That takes courage. This community needs people like you." Mrs. Walker, who had been watching the events unfold, stepped forward and took Elijah's hand in hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We've been waiting for someone to stand up to them for so long." Elijah smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "This is your victory too. You spoke out, and that's what made the difference." Over the following days, the fallout from the confrontation rippled through Elmsford. News of Hayes's arrest and Briggs's suspension spread quickly, sparking both outrage and hope. The hospital staff began organizing to ensure transparency moving forward, with Mitchell stepping into a leadership role to rebuild trust. Elijah met with community leaders, doctors, and residents, laying the groundwork for broader reforms. The hospital would finally receive the resources it needed, and plans were set in motion to establish oversight committees to prevent future abuses. Despite the progress, Elijah couldn't ignore the lingering challenges. Briggs's suspension was only temporary, and the investigation into the police department's practices would be an uphill battle. Still, the momentum had shifted. The community was awake, and their collective voice was growing louder. For Elijah, the ordeal was transformative. As he stood in front of the hospital one evening, watching the sun set over the town, he reflected on everything that had transpired. He had come to Elmsford intending to implement healthcare reforms. But the fight had revealed deeper issues, ones that required persistence, resilience, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. He knew he couldn't solve everything on his own. The systemic problems that plagued towns like Elmsford were far-reaching and deeply rooted. But he also knew that change didn't happen overnight. It was a process, one that required collective effort and unwavering determination. The next day, Elijah met with Captain Daniels at a local diner over coffee. They discussed the ongoing investigations and the steps needed to rebuild trust between the police department and the community. "You've stirred up quite a storm, Dr. Ward," Daniels said with a wry smile. "But it's a storm this town needed." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Change is never easy, but I've seen what this community is capable of when they come together. That gives me hope." Daniel's smile faded slightly. "There's still a long way to go. People like Briggs don't go down without a fight. And there are others like him. People who are deeply entrenched in the system." "I know," Elijah said, his voice firm. "But I'm not going anywhere." Daniels raised her coffee cup in a small toast. "Here's to fighting the good fight." As Elijah walked back to his car, he received a text from Mitchell. "The new budget proposal passed. The staff is behind you 100%. Elijah smiled, the weight of the past weeks lifting slightly. Progress was being made, one step at a time. Before driving away, he glanced at the town's skyline, the hospital standing tall in the distance. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time, he felt a sense of optimism. Elmsford was changing, and he was proud to be part of that change. As he started the car, his phone buzzed again, this time from a journalist requesting an interview. The story of Elmsford's reckoning was spreading, and with it, the hope that other communities might follow suit. Elijah took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The streets of Elmsford bustled with a newfound energy. The hospital, once a symbol of mismanagement and neglect, was gradually transforming into a beacon of hope. The fallout from Richard Hayes's arrest and Officer Briggs's suspension had shaken the town to its core, forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems they relied on. But amidst the upheaval, a fragile sense of optimism had taken root. For Elijah Ward, the journey had been grueling. When he first arrived in Elmsford, he had envisioned a straightforward mission: address the hospital's inefficiencies and provide better healthcare access. He hadn't anticipated becoming a central figure in exposing corruption or sparking a broader movement for accountability. Yet, as he stood on the steps of the hospital one crisp morning, watching staff members unload long overdue medical supplies, he realized that his struggle had become part of something much larger. Elijah had always been driven by purpose. His years as a surgeon and healthcare advocate had taught him the importance of resilience, precision, and compassion. But the events in Elmsford had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. The racism and abuse of power he encountered were stark reminders of battles he had thought he'd left behind. Battles he now realized were far from over. Through the ordeal, Elijah learned to navigate not just the operating room, but also the intricate dynamics of power and resistance. He discovered a deeper well of patience and fortitude within himself, traits that allowed him to stand firm even when the odds were stacked against him. Looking back, he understood that his fight wasn't just about fixing the hospital, it was about challenging the systems that allowed exploitation and bias to thrive. It was about using his platform and privilege to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. The transformation in Elmsford wasn't Elijah's doing alone. It was the courage of people like Mitchell Hayes, who chose truth over loyalty to his father, and Mrs. Walker, who refused to let fear keep her silent. It was the collective power of hospital staff, patients, and community members who rallied together to demand change. Elijah often thought about the night of the confrontation in the hospital office. The sight of the crowd standing their ground, refusing to be intimidated, was etched in his memory. It was a testament to what could happen when people united around a common cause. Since then, the town had begun to heal. Community forums were being held regularly, giving residents a space to voice their concerns and ideas. Plans were underway to establish oversight committees for both the hospital and the police department, ensuring transparency and accountability moving forward. Elmsford's reckoning was a microcosm of larger systemic issues. Elijah knew that for every corrupt administrator like Richard Hayes, there were countless others exploiting their power in similar ways. For every Officer Briggs, there were others perpetuating bias and intimidation, often unchecked. But Elmsford also showed that change was possible. It demonstrated the power of persistence, the importance of speaking out, and the necessity of solidarity. It was a reminder that even in the face of entrenched systems, progress could be made, one step at a time. Elijah reflected on how these issues weren't confined to Elmsford across the nation. Marginalized communities faced similar struggles. His experience had reignited his commitment to not only advocating for healthcare reform, but also fighting against the systemic racism and inequality that permeated so many aspects of society. For Elijah, the work was far from over. The hospital still had a long way to go before it could fully regain the trust of the community. The police department's investigation into Officer Briggs and his allies would take time, and systemic change wouldn't happen overnight. But Elijah wasn't deterred. He had learned to measure progress not by the absence of challenges, but by the presence of collective resolve. The people of Elmsford had shown him what was possible when individuals came together, and he was determined to continue building on that momentum. As he prepared to leave the town for a brief return to his primary practice, Elijah met with Mitchell one last time. The younger man had stepped into a leadership role at the hospital, his resolve growing stronger with each passing day. "Thank you for everything, Dr. Ward," Mitchell said, his voice steady but emotional. "You've changed this place in ways we never thought possible." Elijah smiled, his hand resting on Mitchell's shoulder. "You're the one who made the real difference. Keep fighting for what's right, no matter how hard it gets, and remember, you're not alone." Elijah left Elmsford knowing that the fight wasn't just his. The town had been a battleground, but it was also a catalyst, a spark that could inspire others to confront injustice in their own communities. He hoped that the story of Elmsford would ripple outward, reaching those who needed to hear it most. As he drove away, Elijah thought about the challenges that lay ahead. The road to justice and equity was long and often painful, but it was a road worth traveling. He carried with him the voices of the people he had met, their stories, their resilience, their courage. They were his motivation to keep pushing forward, to keep challenging the systems that sought to hold them back. And as the sun set behind him, casting Elmsford in a warm, golden light, Elijah felt a deep sense of purpose. The struggle for justice was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain: change was possible, and together, they would make it happen.